This is the second part of the interview with Łukasz Adamski. If you've missed the first part, watch it now.
Hello, dear viewers. This is the channel Black Sky Stop Fake. Today, we are talking to my colleague Paweł Bobołowicz about how history is used as a weapon and how Russia is trying to use it to break the unity of its neighbors. Our guest is someone who deals with this issue professionally, the distinguished Polish historian, expert on Eastern Europe, deputy director of the Juliusz Mieroszewski Centre for Dialogue, Dr. Łukasz Adamski.
Mr.
Director, you have raised many issues. We are now witnessing an unpleasant, even vulgar discussion between Wachtan Kipiani and the former director of the Polish Institute, Robert Czyżewski. But on the other hand, there are also people on the Polish side who are fueling the conflict and who claim to be historians.
Wulgarny, nie znam, czy takie słowo ukraińskiej mowy, ale dużo taki, to wulgarny, prosta, wulgarna ataka Kipianiego w bok Czyżewskiego, ale z drugiego boku
Andrzej Zapałowski, currently a member of parliament, Włodzimierz Osacz, and Czesław Bartacz, whose opinions are more political than historical. There are also activists such as Katarzyna Sokołowska. Could the source of the problem lie on both sides? That there are simply people on both sides who are hostile to each other?
Czesław Bartacz, jaki wiem, wyspecjalizowany w Wołyni, ale багато його думок, це не думки історичні, тільки політичне, а не тільки історики, але, наприклад, діячі, які взагалі поширили політичне діє чи суспільне діє.
There are radicals in every society. I have a problem with nationalists because they are unable to think in political terms. They do not understand the complexity of reality and the need for compromise. Too much of the whole truth sometimes causes psychological resistance in the other party.
Чи тут є якийсь спільний цей джерело, наприклад? Чи можна шукати того джерела? Чи то це так самостійно виходить, що з українського боку є такі людей? На жаль, і з польського боку також.
У кожному суспільстві є завжди купка націоналістів, радикалів.
In every society, there is always a group of nationalists, radicals. I have a problem with nationalists in every country because they are unable to think in political terms. They do not understand that the reality we know is much more complex and nuanced than the simplified picture of reality. These ideas of an imaginary Ukraine or an imaginary Poland, which they dream of and want to fight for. Nationalists do not understand that compromises must be made. And yes, the truth sets you free, but sometimes too much truth and the whole truth does not so much allow you to effectively convey information to your partner as it causes them to psychologically resist accepting any information at all. That is why I believe that the discourse on historical truth is somewhat unproductive. Of course, there are such people in Poland too, but there is a certain difference between Poland and Ukraine. While in Ukraine, ordinary people, let's say society, are generally pro-Polish and have a positive image of Poland. In the case of the Ukrainian elite, oh dear, there are more problems with the political elite, as well as the intellectual elite. And here we could talk at length and try to make a clear diagnosis. Why does the Ukrainian elite have certain reservations about Poland? Why do they have certain unnecessary fears? For example, even before the full-scale war began, Well-known Ukrainian journalists predicted that the evolution of the situation in Poland would inevitably lead to Poland and Russia forming some kind of anti-Ukrainian alliance. Where do these fears come from? Where do these complexes come from? That is one question. In Poland, we have the opposite situation. The vast majority of the Polish political and intellectual elite is pro-Ukrainian. We have more of a problem with society, with people who were raised on the same books and the same cultural codes, who think not in terms of political solidarity, but in terms of at least political transactionalism. Well, sometimes people say outright, if Ukraine wants weapons from us, and so on, it has to do this, that, and the other thing. And they don't understand all these complexities. That is why the people you mentioned, Mr. Paweł, exist. But they are not mainstream in Poland. I am not saying that they are marginal, because nowadays this anti-Ukrainian, one might say, Ukraine skeptical discourse is already becoming almost part of the mainstream. This means that it does not function on a par with the traditional Promethean discourse characteristic of Piłsudski. Poland and Ukraine are a common cause. However, politicians, whether from the current government or from the main opposition party, Law and Justice, as well as many individuals and politicians, even from the Confederation, which is usually described in Ukraine as an anti-Ukrainian party, because they are in fact pro-Ukrainian, they would like to help Ukraine, have to work with their constituents. And in order to work with the people, they need to have arguments that are politically effective. And for their help, for this solidarity, they have achieved at least, for example, a change and the unblocking of the long-standing issue of exhumation. Or, for example, they have achieved that Ukraine will say that Poles in Volhynia were killed by members of the UPA and not by some little green men. If this does not happen, if they do not see such gestures or such a reaction from Ukraine, they will conclude that they may suffer losses and lose politically on the Ukrainian issue. In this way, the entire Polish political discourse, including those who are completely pro-Ukrainian, loses a certain willingness to deal with the Ukrainian issue because they may lose politically. That is why I have spoken a lot about the responsibility of the Ukrainian political and intellectual elite for the fact that the Volhynia issue was not resolved at the best moment, i.e., after the Maidan. And now we are simply dealing with the consequences of these omissions. And we must do everything we can to combat anti-Ukrainian sentiments in Poland in order to overcome such primitive discourse. But I don't want to simply say who is more to blame and who is less. However, I would like to point out that even if we agree with the thesis that the stronger side, in this case Poland, naturally bears greater responsibility for the state of relations than the weaker side, Ukraine, I would also like to say that the weaker side, Ukraine, will lose more from the failure to resolve these issues. Because it is Ukraine that is at war with Russia, not Poland. It is Ukraine that is asking for military and financial aid and so on.
prosić допомоги військової, фінансової і так далі, а не Польща. І тому це теж в інтересі України
Therefore,
є
it
зрозуміти
is in
врешті вагу
Ukraine's
цієї
interest
проблеми
to
і не
understand the
говорити
importance of this
не
issue and not
намагатися
to be afraid of the reaction of right-wing circles such as Kipiani and so on if they protest against historical gestures towards the Polish government. At the same time, one should not be afraid of radicals, but ultimately show courage and say a few words that will help Poland's friends in Ukraine reduce the political significance of this problem. This is a burden that limits the room for maneuver of Polish politicians.
Wagу цієї проблеми, цей тягар, який звужує поле маневрів для польських політиків.
Пане директоре, нещодавно була зміна в українському
Mr. Director, Oleksandr Alfyorov, a historian, officer, and well-known blogger, has become the director of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. Could this change be the beginning of a breakthrough in historical dialogue?
Як ви думаєте, чи та зміна може бути таким початком зміни в діалозі, історичному діалозі між Польщею і Україною?
Я скажу так, я би так хотів, щоб так було.
Let me put it this way. I would very much like that to be the case. I don't know Mr. Alfyorov very well, but I have had several private conversations with him some time ago. And after those conversations, I had an absolutely positive impression. The fact that people who know him much better than I do also have a good opinion of him also speaks in favor of this. I would very much like this to be the case. And I would say that this is a departure from the exaggerated historical policy based on various nationalist myths about Poland, which was pursued by Mr. Wiatrowicz and Drobowicz. But will this be the case? Well, I don't know. Firstly, because an institution is not only its director, but also, I would say, its colleagues and employees. We will see what direction this institution takes. Will it be a continuation or a continuation with corrections? Secondly, I myself publicly praised Mr. Alfyorov and wished him all the best, hoping that...
Сподіваючись на те, щоб
Я більше скажу, ви трошки його захищали навіть перед польськими.
You even defended him in the Sejm when he was accused of having ties to the Azov regiment.
А ви підкреслили якраз цей позитивний елемент.
Ну, саме так. І я все-таки, бо я вірю теж, що людині, яка, судячи з всього, немає...
Yes, exactly, and me too. Because I believe that a person who, judging by all accounts, has no anti-Polish sentiments, who understands the importance of Polish-Ukrainian cooperation, should be helped and given a certain amount of trust. But a few days later, the issue of Alfyorov's interview, which he gave a few months ago, came up. Well, I just threw up my hands when I heard that you can try to talk positively about Hitler in some way, that Hitler was a man raised in high German culture, and that Putin is some kind of dickhead. I'm very sorry for using that term, but that's more or less how it sounded. And that Putin understands nothing. That's right, and the Third Reich was a high-end European civilization. Please understand that even if Russian propaganda highlighted this interview, well, I would say a little without showing all the theses. It showed it without context. But well, it was a huge mistake. You can't do that. You can't justify Nazism. You can't praise Hitler for both ethical and political reasons. I'm sorry, I understand that it was a mistake, but if there are a few more mistakes like this, it will turn out that Polish institutions or historians will not want to cooperate or meet with people who have such a reputation. These are the crimes of Hitler's Third Reich. Therefore, I understand this goodwill, but I also see a certain danger that stems from a lack or even a shortage of political experience. And this is politics. Polish-Ukrainian talks about the past are part of politics. That is why we must be very careful.
Rozmowy про минуле – це частина політики. Тому я такий трошки осторожний.
Tutaj, panie dyrektorze, ja z wami погоджуюсь, бо дуже часто,
I agree.
на жаль,
Ukraine often tries to troll Russia with hyperbole about the Third Reich.
Робити таку гіперболу цієї пропаганди російської і грати на тих
But in effect, this fuels Russian
Рейху, але ми читали
propaganda.
часто тоді українці дають зброю, задарма дають зброю українській
так.
пропаганді.
А коли Путін почав говорити, що
Exactly. If Putin says that 2 plus 2 equals 4, Ukraine cannot claim that it equals 6 just because Putin said so. The Ukrainian elite must understand that it is not the center of the world. Help comes from understanding the Russian threat, not from the fact that the world revolves around Ukraine. We must keep things in perspective.
Треба зберегти почуття pewnych proporcji.
Panie dyrektorze, na żal nasz czas закінчився, хоча в голові
Doctor,
знову маємо
unfortunately,
багато
our
питань.
time
Я
is
надіюся, що
up.
ми просто швидко повернемося
I hope we will
до
return
нашої
to
розмови.
this
Але я також
conversation
надіюся,
soon,
що
perhaps
нашим
with
гостем
the
буде
new
новий
director
директор
of the
Українського інституту
UIPN.
національної пам'яті. Я вже таке запрошення скерував, чекаю на відповідь. Надіюся, що як буде, то ви будете нашим глядачом і щоб взагалі...
Thank you for joining us. Let me remind you that our guest was Dr. Łukasz Adamski, director of the Juliusz Mieroszewski Centre for Dialogue. Director, or rather deputy director, thank you.
Wicedyrektor, chyba треба сказати.
I must clarify that I am the deputy director, but the protocol allows me to be addressed as director.
В майбутньому хто знає.
In the future, who knows? Thank you very much.
Функція в тому я можу бути впевнений.
Black
Дуже
Sky
дякуємо,
Stop
щиро
Fake.
дякуємо за
Artur
сьогоднішню
Żak.
зустріч.
Paweł
Чорне небо,
Bobołowicz.
Artur Żak, Paweł
Goodbye.
Bobołowicz. До побачення.